Hi guys, Harbs Narbs here. This video will be the first part of a series that takes a look at the history of Dragonlance in Dungeons and Dragons. I've done other videos like this before, focusing on the Forgotten Realms and Planescape, the links of which are down below. You may notice that there isn't a part 3 to the Planescape series, even though I said I'd do one. Sorry about that. Also, a big thank you to my latest patron Luke, cheers for signing up. Okay, let's go. You've likely heard of Dragonlance because it is one of the most famous settings for Dungeons and Dragons, a vast fantasy world set upon the planet of Krynn, where the majority of adventures take place upon the continent of Ansalon. And whilst Dragonlance is vastly different to the arguably more famous Forgotten Realms, certain parallels can be drawn between the two, given that they are both examples of classic sword and sorcery where magic and the gods play a heavy role in the life of mortals. Of course, the two differ in their cosmologies, pantheons and political backdrops. If you have heard of Dragonlance but don't remember where from, it could be that you have read about a recent lawsuit between Wizards of the Coast, the publishers of Dungeons and Dragons, and the co-creators of the setting, Tracy Hickman and Margaret Weis. This lawsuit has been dropped, but originated when Hickman and Weis were commissioned by Wizards to write a new set of Dragonlance novels, only to have Wizards of the Coast allegedly pull the plug on the project. Anyway, safe to say that it is back on, and I've linked the court documents below if you'd like to have a further read. So, how did Dragonlance all begin? We can see in 2004's 30 Years of Adventure, a celebration of Dungeons and Dragons, the following. Tracy Hickman, a Mormon, had returned from his mission abroad in Indonesia in March 1980. He married his sweetheart, Laura Curtis, in June, and the young couple struggled to make ends meet. Laura Curtis had introduced Tracy to D&D in 1977 before he went abroad. Hickman became fascinated with the game, working with his wife to design their own modules, covering page after page of graph paper with detailed diagrams of dungeons. Dragon Magazine number 120 from the year 1987 goes into more detail about how Laura introduced Tracy to D&D. His first brush with Dungeons and Dragons games came when his wife Laura failed to pick him up after work one day. Understandably upset, Tracy rode his bike across town where he found his wife at the house of a friend, so totally engrossed in a game that she had forgotten about him. Hickman did eventually self-publish several modules, and in 1980 Mike Gray from TSR picked up a copy of one. Gray was impressed enough to set up an interview for Hickman in Lake Geneva. Not that one, here in Wisconsin, where Dungeons and Dragons was born. In March 1981, Tracy set off from Utah to Wisconsin with his wife, a job awaiting for him at TSR, and this job offer couldn't have come sooner. In the same Dragon magazine, it is stated that Tracy's financial situation was so bad that he said sending modules into TSR for payment was done so that he could literally buy shoes for his children. On the car ride over to Lake Geneva, Tracy and Laura discussed ideas that had been brewing for several years. What about a world dominated by dragons? What about an entire world to support a storyline? Well, a world dominated by dragons was seen as a rather perceptive idea by TSR's marketing department, who had apparently already concluded in the early 80s that TSR products had plenty of dungeons but not enough dragons. However, it wasn't an idea that was immediately set in motion. TSR was a relatively big company by then, with many projects under its belt. Therefore, Harold Johnson, who was a game designer at TSR and the assistant to the vice president for research and development, suggested to Hickman that he should go into the various departments of TSR to gather support for Dragonlance. Hickman and Johnson first pitched the idea to the art staff at an evening meeting held in artist Larry Elmore's basement. If you don't recognize the name Larry Elmore, you'll certainly know the art, as he's responsible for some of the most wonderful D&D images of that period. The push to get Dragonlance into development was initially described as an underground movement, a small group in 1981 that consisted of not only Larry Elmore, Tracy Hickman and Harold Johnson, but also Jeff Grubb, Roger Moore, Doug Niles and Michael Williams. Let's take a look at what Margaret Weis has to say about this during an interview at GaryCon in 2019.
So Tracy presented it to the company because the company put out a call that said, look, we've got lots of dungeons. This is when they hired Tracy and he was working there as a game designer. We've got lots of dungeons, but we don't have a lot of dragons. And so Tracy said,
we are not living up to our name.
In the name, you gotta have more dragons.
Tracy said, I just happen to have this game where knights are riding on the back of dragons, and he presented it to the company and they loved it. So they formed the group, the game designers. Larry Elmore, they were at Larry Elmore's house one night, and Larry was so interested. They told him all about it, and he drew some of the characters. And they made this whole presentation to management, and management really liked it. And so they agreed that they would do Dragonlance, and that Dragonlance was going to be the first game world with a continuing story arc.
Meanwhile, whilst the effort to get Dragonlance underway was taking place at TSR, Margaret herself was hired by the company, starting in 1983 and working for the book department as a coordinator. Her previous experience involved working as an editor for a small publishing company in Independence. Margaret initially applied for a role as a game editor at TSR, but was actually rejected. It was down to the book division manager Gene Black, knowing Margaret's literary agent Ray Puchner, that helped Weis get a role at TSR after Ray recommended her. So it's 1983, Margaret Weis and Tracy Hickman are both working at TSR, and Hickman's underground team have concluded that in addition to Dragonlance game modules, there should be novels that would tell the story of the world, which was apparently only grudgingly accepted by TSR at the time, mainly because this was a new idea. The problem was that TSR wanted to hire a separate author to create these novels, but there was a very clear problem with this in that many of the ideas about the world had already been fleshed out by Tracy and his wife a couple of years earlier. It was sort of their baby. Margaret explains that car journey here where the Hickmans created Dragonlance.
So he and Laura, while they were driving from Utah to Lake Geneva, Tracy wanted to come up with a game that he could give to this company who had fulfilled his dream. And they came up with a game world in which knights rode on the backs of dragons. And there were 3 characters, Tanis, Laurana, and Kitiara. And the 3 characters represented the balance in the world. Neutral was Tanis, Kitiara was evil, and Laurana was good. And that was how Dragonlance was created. That was the beginning.
So how did Weis get involved with the project? Margaret's role at the time was to head up the new Dragonlance project within the book department, which was given the title of Project Overlord. According to Dragon magazine, Margaret was part of a committee to select the author who would not keep any of the copyright to their work and in general would get quite a raw deal. Now, Margaret's job wasn't just to find an author, she was also responsible for taking the story ideas from the modules being created by the Dragonlance team and to condense them into a workable story, whereby this author could then transform them into a trilogy of books. The combination of modules and novels was actually a very important turn for D&D, and Laura Hickman, the wife of Tracy, is described as follows by Margaret.
A continuing story arc. Laura Hickman invented the idea of story in games.
Wow.
Yeah, not a lot of people know that.
I don't think she gets enough credit for that.
I know, she doesn't. So she invented the idea of telling a story in a game instead of just like Tracy says, kill the dragon, get the treasure.
Right.
Next month, kill the dragon, get the treasure.
In fact, Strahd von Zarovich was created by the Hickmans out of their desire to have a more fleshed out story, but that'll be a different video for a different setting. The point is that Laura's contribution to Dragonlance and D&D was massive, even if it was actually Margaret and Tracy that ended up co-authoring the first books, which in turn were linked to the modules. However, how did that partnership happen? After all, Tracy was designing modules and Margaret was in charge of finding an author to write the novels. In A Celebration of Dungeons & Dragons, it is written that an author was eventually found, but that the design group found themselves disillusioned by his work. The article doesn't elaborate as to why they were disillusioned, but in an interview with Tracy Hickman and Margaret Weis from 2002 on sfcrowsnest.com, Margaret states that TSR wanted to get some real big names in science fiction fantasy, but they couldn't afford it for one, and for two, none of the really big people wanted to write books and characters they didn't have the copyright on. So it could be that the author that they did manage to acquire wasn't talented enough for the project, or perhaps it was simply that they were lacking in passion for it. It was actually Michael Gray, a game designer at TSR who had previously worked closely with Gary Gygax on a board game called Dungeon, that initially started suggesting that Tracy and Margaret write the novels themselves, and it was with Gray's encouragement that over a weekend the pair wrote the prologue and the first 5 chapters. The following Monday, Weis and Hickman took the manuscript to Gene Black, the head of the book department, and allegedly, according to A Celebration of Dungeons & Dragons, Black took it to her office and shut the door. After an interminable amount of time, she opened it again, looked at Weis and Hickman sitting in Weis's cubicle across the hallway and said, "Wow." The original author was fired and the project was firmly in the hands of Tracy and Margaret. You're perhaps wondering why Margaret was involved, if she, like the fired author, was never actually involved in the original formation of the Dragonlance world. Well, this is clarified somewhat in the SF Crow's Nest interview, when Tracy has the following to say about his own writing. Up to Dragonlance, all of my writing experience had been in fantasy games, which is very much technical writing. You deal with sequence, you deal with clarity of instruction, you deal with process. It is a very formal type of writing with its own discipline. In fact, when I started with TSR, I was so bad that every sentence began with a prepositional phrase. It made dreadfully boring reading. All of my sentences were passive, there was no variation in the sentence structure at all, let alone my ability to organize my thoughts on a larger scale. This was contrast to Weis, who had a degree in creative writing and previous experience in writing and editing books. Also, from what I have read, there seemed to be a rapport between the two that no doubt solidified a good working relationship. However, even though the folks at TSR were convinced by the partnership and their own combined writing ability, Random House, TSR's distributor, were not, and were apparently unhappy that TSR were using two unknown authors to write the trilogy. Eventually, they settled with the lowest possible printing of the first book, titled Dragons of Autumn Twilight, which was published in November 1984, 7 months after the Dragons of Despair module, which corresponded to the first half of the novel, was released. Now, these Dragonlance modules were slightly controversial when they were first published. They were truly story-driven, and this was important for Tracy and his wife, who had had previously negative experiences of playing D&D without any story or structure as to why the characters were doing the quests, or what happened after the quests. The new Dragonlance modules would all be linked to each other, and players could go from one to the other. To give the idea of a story, the players could only use pre-generated characters, and let's see what Margaret had to say about this.
It was also one of the first modules to have pre-generated characters, which caused a whole lot of controversy in the company. Gary did not like the idea of pre-generated characters, but they kind of needed it to make the whole thing work.
Right.
They thought, although they realized later that they really didn't, that people liked making their own characters and then just coming into the world. But they didn't know that then.
But Dragonlance was the setting to give D&D its sense of story, instead of its sense of pure dungeon crawling. Let's take a look at Dragon Magazine number 91 from November 1984 and see what Margaret Weis has to say about the link between the modules and the novels. We worked very hard to make the locations and settings coincide with those appearing in the game modules, so that a gamer might read the books and say, "Gee, I know this place. Our group fought the Draconians here." Or he could remember the books while gaming and say, "This was the decision Tanis had to make in the book. I think I'll do it differently and see what happens." Dragons of the Autumn Twilight was more seen as a way to bring life and story to Dungeons & Dragons. Whether that story was particularly well written is debatable, but it was no doubt popular among its readership at the time. Anyway, thanks for watching guys. If you enjoyed this video then do please give me a like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Bye!